All right, you're good to go, and you ladies can see Brendan's screen.
Yes, just fine.
Yeah,
Okay,
you can
and
see
Mark
I've
as
got,
well. Cool.
yeah, I've got the accounting link, Retail Pro 9, and then QuickBooks in the background. You can all see that in the middle of your screen, I hope. So I guess let's start with a little bit of an overview. So the accounting link is our, I guess, financial link to accounting software, and it links with QuickBooks, BusinessWorks, and Mass90. I know that for the purposes of this demo, we're going to just go through the QuickBooks link because it has some specific characteristics that the other two links don't have. It doesn't have, a dynamic direct connect to the database in QuickBooks, and there are a couple of accounts that need to be handled in a different way than other accounting packages. So that's what we're going to kind of go through today with respect to the QuickBooks specific link piece of it. The accounting link basically takes transactions in Retail Pro, receipts, slips, transfers, memos, and breaks them down into the various accounts that make up GL entries in the accounting package that we're linking to. And so we'll go through how that's set up in the preferences of the accounting link, and then we'll go through what it looks like on the QuickBooks side, and then we'll make a few transactions going back to QuickBooks, see how they post. We'll do general ledger for receipts, vouchers, memos, and slips, and then we'll come back and do, or along the way we'll also do accounts receivable and accounts payable, and we'll make payments on the accounts receivable for our customer. So we see how that all works between the two packages, between Retail Pro and QuickBooks. So I think I'll start by going through some of the preferences in the accounting link. And well, actually, I guess we should start with the accounting package. And right now I'm using 2010 QuickBooks because that's the last version that we actually certified with. The newer versions have been field certified by business partners, and I think we're up to 2012 or 2013. 2010 is the one that we've currently been using in-house for most of our testing. And the reason it's not that important for us to test the latest one or certify each package with QuickBooks is because it uses a pretty standard convention for introducing the data into the accounting system, and that's through these IIF files, which are pretty standard text files that QuickBooks uses for importing and exporting data, and that doesn't change over time, so we can pretty much expect that the most current version, unless they change that underlying technology, is going to work. So that's where we are with this. So in
if the new
QuickBooks,
client came in with 212, we would be comfortable installing the link if they were using a later version than the 2010 version? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, what we typically say is, and we've had business partners that have already installed and confirmed that 2012, for instance, works. But what we typically recommend is that you take that version and run a couple of tests. Make sure that it works, nothing has changed. Offline first, and then introduce it into their environment. But yeah, it's pretty safe to say that you wouldn't find anything too major.
Okay, and could we get support from RPI on that if it was a later version than 2010?
Yeah, we might need to work with you directly to get access to that version, like in your lab or somewhere along the line, so that we could help identify any issues to confirm that it's not a configuration issue. And then if it turned out that it was something like needed to be changed in the link itself, then we'd have to take that as a development issue and fix that.
Okay, so, perfect. Okay, sorry.
No problem. So then we have our chart of accounts, which is kind of the heart of the system, and there are various accounts that we rely on from the accounting link that need to be set up. And once I start going through the store account manager in the accounting link preferences, we'll go through those. But just to kind of give you the high level on the accounting package itself, it's got an account for essentially every financial piece that we will record data into from the accounting link, and they're all configured here in the chart of accounts. And There are a couple of specific types of accounts. There's accounts receivable, which is a certain kind of account that's handled differently from a standard GL account. There's also an accounts payable account, which is handled slightly different. Accounts receivable is for customers and tracking their ongoing credit balances with you and or charge balances with you, and then accounts payable, of course, are your vendor payments and things that you're tracking to pay at the end of the month. So there are a couple of specific things in the Retail Pro link that need to be configured around those two special types of accounts, and we'll go through that once we get into the Store Account Manager. There's also a tax account or a tax type account in QuickBooks that's a special type of account that we have to work around as well, because we can't post directly to that. So the merchant or the customer needs to work with or use a general ledger account that we're posting to in order to reconcile their tax. It's a little bit of a workaround in terms of that piece. I think they have to transfer from this account into their tax account in order for it to reconcile. So there's a little bit of information that we'll be looking at when we get into the link preferences regarding that as well. So QuickBooks itself, I mean, your customer will be pretty well familiar with how it works, and they'll know the various areas. The customer area is essentially the accounts receivable area from our standpoint anyway. And the vendor area, the vendor center, is where the accounts payable information is tracked, the vendor and each one of their respective balances. So that's kind of what these areas mean from a Retail Pro standpoint. You have the accounts receivable for customers, the accounts payable for vendors, and then chart of accounts for virtually everything else, which is the general ledger, essentially. So that's kind of the way around in QuickBooks itself. In the accounting link, the corresponding accounts that we look at live in what we call the Store Account Manager, and we'll go through those in a minute. But before we do that, I want to go through kind of the preferences in general to set it up for use with QuickBooks, the link that is. So the first preference helps you identify what kind of accounting package you're linking to, and in this case, we're looking at QuickBooks. So for the General Ledger module or the GL module, we select the appropriate entry, and on down the line, same with Accounts Receivable or AR module and the AP module. And that, at this point now, we're telling the system, okay, use the scripts that format the output from Retail Pro in a file that can be used then by QuickBooks. That's what these do. Down here for QuickBooks, you have to turn on a flexible account structure. And there's a reason for that, because we can't really handle the sub-accounting that you can use in other accounting packages. So that's the limitation with QuickBooks that we're stuck with. And the flexible account structure simply means that you can use text characters and things like that in order to identify the accounts. But you don't have to worry about...
I'm sorry, Brendan.
Sure.
Where is this option? What page are you on? I'm following you along with my setup.
Sure.
Are you into just GL accounts there?
Yep. We'll go into Options,
Okay.
Preferences, and then we'll go to GL Accounts.
GL accounts. Okay,
Yep.
good. I gotcha.
So the key setting here is turn on Flexible Account Structure for QuickBooks. And then essentially the rest of these, because we don't handle the sub-accounting feature in QuickBooks, we're going to just zoom right by them because we don't break out the accounting in that way with QuickBooks. So the next set of, I guess, preferences that can be considered or should be considered for any accounting package would be these, the GL tenders, the tenders that are recorded on receipts that you want to be read in and posted to the accounting package need to be activated here. If you're using this option, this Use Purchase Clearing Account for Vouchers, that's a specific preference that apparently is fairly unusual in the accounting world, but because every time we get to this, most of the accountants go, what's purchase clearing? But what it basically is it just tells the system, if I put a voucher in the system and I don't have a date assigned for the payment, I haven't paid for it and I don't have the invoice number for it yet, I still want it to be read into the general ledger. Ordinarily, an accounts payable document, a voucher that's already been recorded with a date and a invoice number would be the only thing that would be read in. in the accounts payable piece or the voucher piece of the accounting link. When you turn this preference on, it tells the system, read it anyway and put it into a special account, and then later when I post the voucher that goes with it, it'll flesh out that extra account and apply the accounts payable amount to the vendor, and the inventory will already be accounted for. The way I understand it, this particular method of tracking vouchers is simply a way for you to introduce the value of the inventory itself into the system before you've actually paid for it, which I guess ordinarily you wouldn't do from an accounting standpoint. So that's what the purchase clearing does. It allows you to basically realize the value of your inventory in your accounting system prior to having actually paid for it with the voucher. And then you can later come back and post against that. Sure.
So, Brendan, it does isolate those pending ones, though, in this unique clearing account. So what would?
Go ahead.
So basically, it's not getting posted into your inventory account. It's getting posted into this, what I would call a holding account, a clearing account, until you actually pay for it. Then does that cause a discrepancy if you would make a change? Say you get the invoice in and the invoice is, $50 more than what you show on your receiving. And how does that get reconciled?
It would, and if you're in a situation where that's the common practice, I would recommend that you probably don't use purchase clearing, although the way that it would be reconciled in the system would be to actually make that reconciliation in the accounting package when you reconcile that AP invoice in the system.
Okay, and not in Retail Pro then?
Correct. Yeah, not in Retail Pro because... Go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, from your experience, do most of your clients turn that off then? Because I would think that they'd want it to agree.
It's usually off by default. Yeah, and I think that's why it causes questions whenever I come across this preference as to what it actually does. That might be why, because I don't know that many people use it. Ordinarily, they don't want the voucher to be read in until after they've put the invoice number and date on it, and then it's read in as an AP document and it's posted as an AP document, and it's just reconciled that way. If any changes need to be made in the financial software later, they can simply make them there.
Okay.
So that's the trickier, I guess, of the GL options. The other one, split merchandise sales into original sales and discount amount. That's just a way to read in receipts and separate the merchandise sales, the original sale, from the discounted amount, as I understand it. And I don't typically see that turned on either. AR options. So this is the customer-based, charge line that you're tracking in the system for your customers that have been designated as accounts receivable customers or customers that will carry a charge balance. There are specific tenders that are typically used for AR transactions, and usually it's COD and charge of course being the primary one. And then you'll typically have one fee in your system in Retail Pro preferences that's designated as the payment fee. This is the one that when a customer comes in and wants to put something on their account, they can do it directly through Retail Pro rather than going into the accounting package and making the payment there. So we have a designated fee in Retail Pro preferences. We can call it whatever we want. In this case, I've named it POA, and it's fee number 1. And I'm telling the system that this is going to be considered an AR tender in a sense. So anytime I receive a fee with an amount that's tendered by any other tender than an AR tender, consider it an AR tender, and it will be drawn against or applied to the customer's AR account in the accounting package when it's posted. In other words, decrementing what they owe and bringing them closer to being paid off or fully paid off, depending on the amount that they owe. So that's what that does.
And then, Brendan, do you set up some kind of a tender payment called POA through Retail Pro?
It's actually just the fee itself, and the way that it is handled is you just tender it by whatever tender amount or tender they're using
They're
to
doing.
tender that receipt. So if they came in and gave you a check and it's not, and check is not flagged as an AR tender, and they put $10 in a fee on the receipt, they tendered it by check, it post over as a $10 tender by check and decrement the customer's AR balance by that $10 or whatever that amount was.
I see. Okay, so you set up a fee in Retail Pro called POA.
Correct. And in fact, let me show you.
And then, and because I tried to rename my fee and I can't do it in here, so.
Oh yeah, gotcha. Sorry about that. Would be under here. So in System Preferences, in V9 anyway, to be Local Preferences, Point of Sale, and then General, and then Fees and Shipping. And here you can see where I've given fee number 1 the name POA. So it's something I manually designated on my own. You could call it anything you want.
Okay, and then how do you get POA in QuickBooks, though?
Right, and that actually is a good fundamental question because once you've done that, when you launch the link, there are certain preferences in Retail Pro that it reads, and among them are these things: the fees, DFs, discounts, anything that you have defined in System Preferences will be read in, and that's one of the many things that are read into System Preferences when you go into the accounting link, and when you go into its preferences, it's reflecting the ones that are defined in Retail Pro.
Okay,
So in your case,
great.
you didn't see POA because it wasn't defined on your side.
Okay, and I'm assuming you'd have to refresh that screen if you do it, if you add one, and then you would have to come back in and refresh the link.
Yeah,
right?
you'd actually have to go all the way out and then back into...
And relaunch it.
Yep.
Okay.
And then once you get back into preferences, you'll see it.
Okay.
Yep. And then so these little guys here don't really matter in Retail, not in Retail Pro, but in QuickBooks, because the external terms option doesn't really apply. The terms in QuickBooks are managed essentially in QuickBooks, so there's no real necessity to set this one way or the other. COD days, I don't think that would really matter in this case. These options down here, though, are fairly important because you'll want to know how you're going to send the customer over and in what fields do the address information go to. So for the Retail Pro address 1, you want to use whichever one of these you want it to be in. And then for address 2, on and on and on. And these designate specific areas for those fields to go in the import file. And then when you import it into QuickBooks, they'll appear in that format. AP options, something similar with relation to the address information. You can designate which ones go where. I mean, obviously this would be the typical default. These two options here are basically for Mass 90, so they wouldn't apply. You can apply in 9 series a default terms. In 8 series, in 8 series you don't have this option to apply it. But again, in Mass 90, in Mass 90 and BusinessWorks, there's more of a direct link, and the terms are handled differently. In QuickBooks, it's fairly simplified, so that issue, these term conditions wouldn't apply necessarily, although you can put a default term onto a vendor so that it's reflected on the document. You still, in QuickBooks, have to apply that discount directly onto the transaction. It won't come over as part of the post. So that's pretty much all of these significant APTC options. System options are just some of the ways that it behaves when you do things like enter and exit preferences. It'll ask you, do you want to delete the batches that are already in there? Do you want to send all marked active batches when you read and post? You can read in separate batches for each store or numerous batches at over time, and this option simply tells to send all. I typically turn it off because I prefer to see each batch go through and post and or fail. In this case, because we're using QuickBooks, it again doesn't matter as much because everything is simply being created as a file that will be manually imported using that import utility I pointed you to earlier in QuickBooks. So you kind of have control over this anyway. So in the case of QuickBooks, you may want to just go ahead and turn it on because it's simply going to create a number of files anyway that you have control over when they're imported. And then these are pretty self-explanatory. They're just prompting and things like that for purging, where the menu is, the basic UI stuff. Printing, there aren't any default designs because there's really not a need in most cases to print whatever's in the accounting batch log area, although it's fairly simple and almost easier. Simply highlight the batch and right-click and export it to either a text file or an Excel spreadsheet. So I don't think we've ever had any need to create any designs, but there are, elements here and a schema in the doc designer. If you needed to create one, you certainly could. So those are all the pretty much basic general accounting link preferences. That covers virtually any package that we link to. The only thing left, the only significant thing left, is really the important part, which is the wiring harness between the accounting link, or between Retail Pro 9 and QuickBooks, which is basically the store account manager. And this is really the guts, as it were, of the application, because this is where you define what parts of a transaction go where in the accounting package itself from Retail Pro. In the case of QuickBooks, ordinarily you don't have a direct link between QuickBooks and Retail Pro. If you do export the chart of accounts, though, in QuickBooks, you can simulate a link by creating a file over here in the QuickBooks side that allows you to then pull up this list and even check against that list of accounts. So this list of accounts here has to have a corresponding account that lives in the chart of accounts. And if you wanted to be able to do what I did just there, where you're able to see that list of accounts that live in this QuickBooks account system, you can create a file called the chart of accounts out of QuickBooks using the file naming convention that we show in the documentation, which is export list to IIF files, and then you're going to click chart of accounts and OK. And the name of the account, or the name of the file that we're looking for the company, would be COA chart of accounts _ rpro.iif. And the reason I say rpro is because that happens to be the name of my company. See? So the name of my company is the middle part of the export. Go ahead and save that, and it's going to replace it. That's OK, because hopefully it's the same. Once you do that, there's an area down here where you designate the location of those IIF files. And as long as we're looking in that location and that file exists, we'll get this. So there's your chart of accounts. So the Store Account Manager is pretty integral to the integration between QuickBooks and Retail Pro. So before we actually dig into that, I'll come back down here to these parts, which is where you define where QuickBooks is. These are QuickBooks specific preferences. You define where QuickBooks lives, but not really where it lives. In this case, all you're doing is you're telling the accounting link, where do you want to leave and pick up files from? In this case, the only file we're picking up is that chart of accounts, but where do you want me to look for files or post files? And in this case, I've taken what is effectively the default, because it's where the company files live in the QuickBooks directory structure. I can take you there. And there you see, sure enough, there's our chart of accounts, and this is the path down to that location. So you need to have that set in order to export that, or read that exported chart of accounts, because that's where the account link is looking if you're set to look for that company and your folder is there. There are a couple of other accounting or QuickBooks specific preferences that need to be considered. And these don't really, I'd say they're specific to QuickBooks because none of the other accounting packages really need this kind of detail that we have here. There, as I mentioned, the accounting package in the case of QuickBooks has a couple of different account types, and there are some of them that we have to work around differently than we do with other accounting packages. Two of them are the accounts payable account and the accounts receivable account. We still have to post to those two accounts. We just have to do it outside of the store account manager. So this is the store account manager where normally all of the posting occurs to all accounts in an accounting package. But in the case of QuickBooks, there are a couple of special accounts that we don't do that, and one of them is the accounts payable, for instance. So over here, we have an accounts payable account, if I can find it. Let's see. All right, and we see that it's of the type accounts payable. So that's our actual accounts payable account. So for that, that'll be designated as our AP account. It'll also be designated as the return AP account. This account here is what it's called. It's a temporary account. It's one that's used to facilitate the posting through the store account manager. So it's of a more standard account type, other current liabilities in the case of accounts payable. And it really is just so that we have a reference to post to here in the store account manager. So in the store account manager, we're posting where you would ordinarily set the accounts payable account. We're posting to that account, which is the accounts payable QB, I believe. Yep. And you can see that's there, and it's of the other current liability types. And this will make a little more sense when we actually do the posting. Likewise, the accounts receivable has... Go ahead.
Brendan, that has nothing to do with that first option, whether you're going to use the clearing account or not. So that's a different type of a clearing account?
That's a different type of clearing account entirely, correct.
Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Just to cover that point, though, we do have an account that's specific, or that I've created specifically for that purchase clearing, and it too would be another current liability account, but it would be defined separately because there's a separate area in the store account manager just for that account. But as I say, that's kind of a separate point. This clearing account will always be empty after the posting. It's only used really to just temporarily place the AP posting in, and then internally in the QuickBooks import process, it'll be applied to the accounts payable account or the account that you have designated here, provided it lives in the accounting package itself. So totally different accounts.
And that AutoUpdate Vendors, if that was checked, what does that do?
Ordinarily, that would send any new vendors that, and you can set this in QuickBooks, but it's typically, it won't do what you would expect it to do in other accounts, where it would automatically apply or automatically send any unsent vendors from the system to the accounting package. In this case, it'll just leave the file there. So it's just so that you don't have to press the Update Vendors button. But from my standpoint, or the way I typically train people, I'll say always update before you post, because you don't want to rely on this being checked or not.
There still is an option like there used to be, like update customers and update vendors?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. At least there was the last time I looked. Yep.
Okay. And initialize customers.
Initialize, correct.
Okay.
Down to AR. It's kind of like, or it's very much like the AP situation. We have this accounts receivable account. It's a specific type of account in QuickBooks. And in this case, there are 3 locations where you designate what account is used for these very specific AR functions. AR account, which is where the accounts receivable amounts will go to. Payments, where that fee you designated as a POA type fee, where those payments will be applied to. And return AR, similar to like we saw with accounts payable. This is where If you make a return, it knows where to post to. And then we have a clearing account for that account too, for that receivable account as well. And this account here, it exists in the system over in QuickBooks. You have to create it, of course, and it would be of the type other current assets typically. So that's what that's used for. And in this case here, this account would be used anywhere you would apply the accounts receivable account if you were setting it up normally. So we've got those two tenders we've identified, COD and charge, so we're putting it there, and then we've also placed it down here underneath the P-type POA, so it'll be applied normally. So those three areas are covered whenever we read and post. Again, that other current assets account, ARC, will be used just to facilitate the transaction. So those are the accounting link, I guess, QuickBooks specific settings, and then the rest of this store account manager configuration is generic. This would happen for any, in terms of the accounts and assigning them to their various areas and identifying the company that you're using, and those sorts of things will all be the same in any accounting package. So one of the first things you have to do before you can link to your accounting package is know the name of the company. And the name of the company is a little important because what I found is it doesn't, although not documented, the system doesn't behave well if you go above 4 or 5 characters for the account name. So I typically advise that you make the account name as small as possible, 3, 4, 5 characters at the most. I usually use RPro because that makes sense. And once you've identified the company name, you then have to put it in here under company for any of the stores that you'll be posting to. And in this case, I've only got the 2. They have to be set to use, or they won't be read in when you post a transaction. Or when you create a transaction in Retail Pro, what happens is when you go into the link to read that transaction, the preferences are read. Are you using store 0? If yes, then read receipts for store 0 or vouchers for store 0, et cetera, and read them into this company. And that's what these 2 things do. This also ties back to the, I guess, the simulation we did earlier where we were creating a store account, or a chart of accounts that store account manager can see. It's looking for this company in that middle part of that file. So when it goes in to look for that list of accounts, it's going to pull up COA_RPro.IAF, and you'll see them here. And this is how you can go through and easily assign the accounts you want to for each one of the various elements of a transaction, whether it's an AR transaction, a standard GL transaction, or an AP transaction. And that's where all of this linking is done, is through the store account manager. So,
and Brendan, I'm assuming that if they're using the numerical value, you would just have to type in the numeric number of the chart of accounts?
Yes, you can do either. You can either type it in or pull it from the list, because it'll export as well.
Okay.
And then once you've got everything assigned correctly, in other words, all the corresponding values here exist here. When you check the chart of accounts, you'll get accounts match. If you have something that doesn't exist there, it'll give you an identifier of what account does not list there. Maybe if we have time at the end when we're doing a little of the troubleshooting, we can go back and break a couple of these so we'll see the lists. So that's pretty much the accounting link preferences and the specific issues with respect to QuickBooks. And I know that's kind of a lot because probably the 2 most important things are the accounts payable and accounts receivable, and that where you define those clearing accounts in Store Account Manager. So if you just remember, anytime I would normally apply the accounts payable account in Store Account Manager, use this one instead. Same with accounts receivable. Anywhere in Store Account Manager, I would normally use this account instead. You'll be fine, as long as they're of the correct type in the accounting package, and of course that they exist. The only other account that makes a significant difference between, I guess, this QuickBooks package and other packages is the sales tax or any kind of tax account in QuickBooks. I use sales tax account because it's an account that I'm using for any kind of tax, so I put it on the voucher tax as well. Obviously, an accountant would probably have a specific account set up for that, but you can see that this account is OCLIAB, which is other current liabilities. So, as I mentioned earlier, in QuickBooks, there is a tax type account, but we can't really post to that. So you would need to create this account here as an other current liability account. And this account exists, we know, because we checked the chart of accounts, so there it is. And that one will get any of the taxes that are broken out off of a document, in my case, either a voucher or a receipt, because I'm using it for both. But that's the only other type of account you have to worry about. And there's one other setting in QuickBooks itself that needs to be set specifically in order for us to post from the link into their software when we import. And that setting is the sales tax. There's a setting inside of QuickBooks, and it's essentially meant for if you're making documents inside of QuickBooks, if you're making sales orders or receipts or something like that, there's an option to use sales tax. And because the thinking is that for this company you're integrating through the accounting link for that purpose, you should set this to no. If you don't, you'll probably have split line errors when you're posting, so that should be set to no for your Retail Pro company. The only other setting that I've always typically turned off or set to the old mode was this one, but even I've had it on today and it doesn't seem to matter, but I'll typically go with the register for QuickBooks 2008 mode and earlier, just because I was a little scared of it and I wasn't sure what it did, but it doesn't seem to matter. So those are the three accounts that you have to worry about: the tax type accounts, the accounts receivable, and the accounts payable that you have to kind of work around with your configuration in QuickBooks and your configuration in the accounting link. And I think that pretty much covers all the preferences. Are there any questions at this point?
Nope.
Okay.
I just have one question. Is there, I'll be honest, I haven't looked through the accounting manual for version 9 yet. Are there like examples, like where all of these have like the fees or the voucher fees or cost of goods sold? Is there an example chart of accounts for us to kind of work from, or is it just all empty and we just have to go find and pull the right one from whatever package the customer's using?
Yeah, in the case of QuickBooks, there isn't an example.
Okay.
There is, I mean, what you can do though is you could create an example set and then save it into a file called something like the COAIIF and import it into QuickBooks. So if you created your sample set, you could then use it in any QuickBooks installation as your sample and then import that COA. And if you want, after this, I can send you the one that I'm using today, and you could use that as your, kind of a...
Do you think that would be helpful, Diane?
Well, actually, I'm in an older version. I'm working on 2005, and they did have a sample chart of accounts
Oh, cool.
Okay.
that I used.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good then. Okay.
To work okay.
All right.
Hi,
And if
Brendan,
you wanted
this is
to...
Mark.
Yep.
So am I correct to assume that when you have a business that has a subsidiary component to it, that you're going to have the multiple instances of the link that are licensed separately to post to different companies, or can you indeed use the same accounting link pre-configured for multiple subsidiaries?
I would recommend, if you're tracking 3 separate subsidiaries, that you have multiple links installed. And an example of it here, you can do that in V9 very easily with the accounting link. There's actually, it's called the Universal Accounting Link Launcher, and if this was, for instance, your HQ, you'd be able to manage all 3 instances, even if they were the same type of accounting. They were, I guess, QuickBooks Company 1, QuickBooks Company 2, QuickBooks Company 3, and then you could launch each one separately. like this. In this case, my subsidiary 1 happens to be Mass 90, subsidiary 2 happens to be BusinessWorks, and subsidiary 3 is QBFS. So that'd be probably the best way to manage multiple companies, and then you'd need a seat license for each one of those subsidiaries, but it's probably a better way to do it. In 8 series, the way we used to do it is, I think, because typically a subsidiary means main, and in those cases there would be 3 separate installations of Retail Pro 8 and then 3 separate installations of the accounting link. In this case, there's 1 installation of Retail Pro 9, and it's got 3 installations of the accounting link, each one linked to the specific subsidiary that lives inside of the Retail Pro installation.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so that covered most of the preferences, and we got to the 9 series piece as well in terms of the the significant preference which was the fee. And then now I think we'll try posting a couple things. Let me bring the company back up though. Back here, I'll just close it. Go back in. Oh, I know what I was going to show you though. It almost slipped my mind. Kind of going back to your point, Diane, if you wanted to, because it depends really on how you're rolling it out over time with customers, but one thing that you can do when you're, pretty much dialed in with the way you want to distribute it, you can come down here and create your own default INI. And what it does is, what the default INI does is, it basically is a way for you to define each one of the company account, each one of the accounts that you want to have assigned to what data type or what transaction element. So in this case, obviously I haven't done anything to change the defaults, because if I hit reset accounts right now, this is what would be reset to. You could modify this file, the default INI, to say receipt fee 11 equals POS fees, which is the account that you will build in, by default into every QBFS install that you do. So you could do something like that and make it a little bit easier. That way when you go for a deployment, you just place this file into the GL folder and then come in and hit reset accounts and no more typing.
Gotcha.
Okay, so now we'll go visit the website. All right. Okay, so let's do a receipt or a couple of transactions. I suppose we should do one of each type, or at least a receipt, an AR, and an AP, so that you can see how that all works. I'll go in and make sure that I've turned off the setting that we're not going to use. Unless you want to see that purchase clearing, I can show it to you.
No, that's okay.
Okay. All right. I don't know if I have a customer. I don't think I do. Oh, I do. All right, great. So we'll start from the beginning. All right. So first we'll initialize our customers. And I'm going to initialize my vendors too, just so I've got it done. But once you've done that, you sent the customers over here. And at this point, before we've done anything, we don't have any customers in our list of AR customers. So I sent it over here by initializing it. And what it did was it took customers out of Retail Pro that have the flag for AR set. And that flag is essentially export to AR, yes or no, or export. In my case, they're both set to yes. If they were new, if I just created it, it would be no by default, and I would want to set it to export. That way, when I did hit update customers, it would send it. It would not otherwise send it unless I hit initialize. So, and initialize, you don't necessarily want to do that every time, because oftentimes address information that is used in the accounting package itself might be different from the original addressing information that was on the customer record in Retail Pro. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be the case very often, but it's possible, so you want to make sure that initialize when you need to, not anytime you need to send customers, unless you're sure it's going to be consistent between the two. So now that we've initialized customers, we'll come over here to the standard area for importing information into the QuickBooks system, IIS. It's looking at that same folder we were talking about before. Just click on it, open it, and in he comes. And there he is. We've got two of them. And there's the one that we were going to make a transaction against. So the customer is there. Nothing else has happened. Let's go ahead and make a receipt. I think you guys have probably all seen this part before, but I mean the posting. But if not, we'll just go through it. Joke. Make that a little bigger. Okay, so I have an AR customer, and now I'm going to make a charge. And again, this doesn't really matter. You'd normally assign the terms to the customer in the accounting package, but I'll just do a 10%, 15 days, and then 30 days net. So now this is going to be an AR transaction for a couple of reasons. One, it has an AR customer on it, one that was flagged as yes or export. And two, because it's got an AR tender on it for that customer. And actually, let me go back and redo that because I skipped right past that. Delete that. So now we're going to read the transaction, and there's two modes of read, preview and marked. Preview is just, I just want to take a look at it. I don't want to flag the transaction as having been read into the system for posting. It's just going to be for review. Marked means mark the transaction, bring it into the accounting link, and then don't read it the next time you come through, because the reading process only takes transactions that aren't marked. And hopefully it will have refreshed by now. And you can see here where those two marks have been set. One's for the AR amount and one's for the GL amount. And here's the breakdown of the transaction. And as you can see, that charge is ARC, and we also have a receivable amount listed in the header of the document. And there's the customer and the receipt number and all the various parts that go into it. So when we go post, it's going to do essentially what it did with the customer initialization. It's going to place it into that folder we designated in preferences, and then we're going to come over to import IIS files. And this is one thing that I always tell people about QuickBooks is it's a little risky. You know, if you're not careful, you have to make sure that you don't bring something in twice, because you theoretically could, and that might generate an error. So make sure that you read these link dates to these documents, and be diligent about moving them out, because there's nothing in QuickBooks that I have found that will automatically move these files out to a different location. So you may want to create like a subfolder that you can use for, you know, sent or whatever you want to call it, and then move them to there later after you've posted it. Maybe get a batch file or something like that. Okay, so we posted the transaction, and we can see where it actually applied a receivable amount to this customer. So now he has a balance. And then in the chart of accounts, we'll see that the accounts receivable now reflects that amount. The AR account is empty the way it should be. The other parts, you know, the inventory was decremented, the tenders were incremented, all that stuff happens automatically. And the sales tax was applied to that other current liability account. So that's pretty much that.
So prior to posting or importing the receipts, it would have been showing up in the ACR, ARC account rather than the accounts receivable account?
No, actually,
it prior,
if it wasn't actually an accounts receivable account, that, if it wasn't an accounts receivable transaction, that account wouldn't be looked at. It wouldn't be touched.
Oh, okay.
And we
Gotcha.
can we'll run a straight GL transaction here, even with the customer. And as long as we don't have an AR tender on it, it's not a qualifying accounts receivable transaction, then it will just post as a simple GL account transaction. So we'll do this one by cash. And then we'll come over here and read that one in. And we'll notice the difference when we bring it in too, because it'll come in and it doesn't have a charge amount.
Right,
The
gotcha.
receivable amount
Okay,
is 0.
yeah.
And it only affects this tender now, which is not the accounts receivable account. So in this
Right.
case, the checking account will go up. And we'll go to utilities and import. They are numbered too, so you know, if you do, like me, keep going through them over and over again. Alright, and there's our checking amount, which goes into the bank. Now we've decremented inventory that much more, and the tax has gone up that much more. So that's that. Let's make a payment on that AR account. That's the other thing I wanted to try. So we'll put the customer on there. We know we have our fee. We're going to make a payment of $10. And that's our POA fee type. Now we're going to tender it by cash. You'll get an error if someone came in and did something like this. I want to make a payment on my account and I want to buy this pair of socks. That'll cause a problem because then it becomes a hybrid transaction. So these POA transactions, they really have to be separate.
Okay.
Combining one with a regular sale will typically generate an error. You'll also get an error if you came in and tried to pay for this POA transaction with COD, because that's also an AR transaction. So it has to be a single AR tender, AR fee with any other tender than an AR tender. And that's that. And then we'll go ahead and read that in. And this one should be a pretty simple transaction. It's going to be the cash amount and then the AR posting itself. And of course it's got the decrement receivable amount there, and we'll post that. There we go. And then we'll find our third receipt. And that one ain't okay. Tax should be the same. Receivable amount went down. ARC is still 0. It should always be 0. And then now we'll look at the customer's account itself, and it also has gone down. There is a piece of QuickBooks that requires the user to do something with this transaction if they want it to be tied to the receipt. I don't normally go into this area, but I played around with it a little yesterday, and I saw what some of the accounting link specialists have talked to me about previously. And in case it comes up in your interactions with customers, auto-apply payments doesn't auto-apply unless you come in here and tell it to apply that payment to this specific invoice. And now it belongs to that invoice, so it decremented the amount to that invoice. I mean, generally it'll pull it off the account, but it won't assign it to a specific transaction. So that's something that you may get questions on. And then there you go. That's pretty much your AR transaction. And now we can try an AP transaction. So we tried a GL transaction, an AR transaction, and a payment on an AR, and then we'll try a...
Hi, Brendan.
Yes.
Prior to moving past the AR, I'm making an assumption that if someone sent in payment to the office and they input the cash the check for AR payment and process that in QuickBooks, would that information flow back into Retail Pro to affect the AR balance that was showing up in the customer record in Retail Pro, or would you have to still do a transaction in Retail Pro if you want your AR totals to show up correctly in the customer file?
No, you'd need to, if you did that, and you, in fact, you want to if you want to maintain any kind of tracking in Retail Pro with respect to the customer's AR balance, you really have to do it in either manually in Retail Pro, or you have to track that in QuickBooks. That's pretty much the only option. We don't get the information back from QuickBooks in Retail Pro or QuickBooks. So that part's completely handled in QuickBooks. Their balance and what they owe, we can't really pull it because there's no return.
Is that just for QuickBooks? Do other packages like BusinessWorks have an import back to Retail Pro?
They absolutely do. Yeah, other packages have the ability to do this. Let me, if I can get back to where I was. I pressed the wrong one. Update customer balances in Retail Pro. Oops, wrong one. Ordinarily in Retail Pro. I picked the slowest machine to do this on, by the way. There we go. Yeah, ordinarily in Retail Pro, that field would have been updated just now when you hit that update, because it would have a direct link between the accounting system and the link, which would pass it through to Retail Pro. So QuickBooks doesn't have that, given the way that we import and export, or export and then import into it, and it's a one-way street pretty much, well, completely, except with respect to the chart of accounts.
Okay.
Okay. So that's,
So Brendan, if you're working, if we were to recommend an accounting program that you feel works the best, is there one that you have as a preference?
well, I think if in most cases for, I guess, small to medium-sized operations, BusinessWorks is probably the best, because it has virtually all the functionality, all the way down to payroll. Not payroll itself, but, sending over check-in, check-out information, commissions and all that. And it does have a direct link. It does the charge balances and all of the AR and AP functions, with the exception of the AP detail functionality that Mass 90 has. Mass 90, which is no longer Mass 90, it's Mass ERP 100 now, is a little more sophisticated and is a little more hardy and has more in-depth accounting functionality. And we play to a little bit of that with terms. We handle the terms better with Mass 90 or Mass 100, and we also handle some of the AP posting functionality a little bit better if you're using the AP detail feature. So it depends on your need, but I'd say, general use, probably BusinessWorks is the best one for your average size
Okay.
company. Yeah. It's also the easiest one to set up from a Retail Pro link standpoint. It's pretty straight. Yeah. Okay, let me bring those vendors in real fast. And there's our vendor. I did skip over one thing in preferences that I should go back to before we go too much further. And it went to the import process, or the export format for vendors and for customers, and specifically for QuickBooks. I don't know how I got past it, but there are two options, and this is typically the one that most people would like because it's the most reader or user-friendly from the readability standpoint. This is the name that'll appear here in the format that it appears. So you have the vendor code and the company name, and in this case, it's a little easier to read. Same with customers. In the case of customers, we were able to identify which customer was which by his name. If we chose the other option, all you get is the word cust underscore and then the customer's ID. So the second option is usually the way to go with these. Because if you decide to change that later and you export customers again, they don't recognize them as being the same customers. You'd have to go back and combine them manually in QuickBooks. So that's an important setting. Okay. And now we'll do a voucher. before we do that, we'll show you how to set the vendor for export. So this is similar to customers. The only difference is when you make a new vendor in Retail Pro, it automatically sets the vendor to export. So, but in order for it to be recognized by the link as being an AP vendor, it has to be set to yes or export, and then of course sent to the accounting package in order for it to be identified in there. And as you can see, we did that when we initialized it was sent. So now we'll make our transaction and make a little bit of AP activity. So in Retail Pro 8, if you've used the link there were really only 2 fields you needed to fill out in order for a voucher to be considered an AP voucher. There was the vendor number and the vendor date. In Retail Pro 9, there's an additional field that you need to set, and that's the vendor amount, or vendor invoice amount, and the vendor invoice date, and then the vendor invoice number. So there's one other field. These 2 amounts, the voucher total and the invoice amount have to match in order for it to be saved correctly. So if you set it to, say, 67, and then we'll give it a date. And then try to save it. It'll say it has to be the same, so these always have to match.
So Brendan, would the process normally be that the bookkeeper would come in and enter the invoice amount and the date when they're getting ready to pay it, and that way they can see if there's any discrepancies and they would change it then?
Yes.
Is that kind of like the purpose of this?
I think that's the normal process. Whenever they make the payment, or whenever they're processing the invoice, whoever is responsible for that part of it would come in and put in the correct invoice amount and the date that it was paid or processed, and then the invoice number, and then they would save it at that point. So the receiving guy gets a voucher and he receives a shipment, and that's all he does is, okay, I got this stuff. He scanned it all in and generated the document, and then later when they go to pay it, the person would fill this part in. I think that's
okay. Yeah, I wouldn't think you'd want your receiving guy filling that.
No. And also, if you're using, if I can interject, if you're also using our vendor invoice functionality, you would create a vendor invoice, right, and then reference the appropriate voucher or vouchers, and it should update the that. I believe it should update that field automatically.
That's correct.
Okay.
In fact, it generates a vendor invoice as soon as you make it. That's the one we just made. Yep.
So you're right. That functionality is really just a way to highlight any discrepancies. You don't have to use it, but if all the bookkeeper is doing is creating the vendor invoices and then referencing the appropriate vouchers, the system will let them know if there's a discrepancy.
Okay.
All right. So now we'll try reading an AP voucher. It should be an AP voucher. We have a qualifying vendor. We have the information related to the vendor invoice, and it comes in as with the vendor code and with a payable amount, and that's there, 468. And when we post it, similar, goes into the same bucket, as it were, for you to import it, and it will have a different name, of course. Bring it in. Now your vendor has this invoice outstanding that you need to pay, or that you've applied to AP. And then I think there's some other parts that go on in the accounting package to reconcile it all at the end of the month. So I'm not too familiar with it, but I know that this piece, where it posts to and how it behaves from a posting standpoint, applying the vendor's amount to the vendor and what accounts get affected, is consistent with other accounting packages that I've played with. So that's pretty much all there is to it. There's the accounts payable amount. The inventory was incremented as it should have been up from where it was, and then anything else that would have been on that voucher would have been applied as well. So it's pretty straightforward as long as you have that offsetting clearing account, which should be empty all the time. The accounts payable clearing is the one that we're using, I believe, down here. Yeah, accounts payable QB, and it's 0.
Can you go back to that screen for a second, Brendan?
This one?
Yes. What is the out of balance at the top? How does that function?
If this total down here doesn't balance on both sides, the batch total for debit and credit, if they don't jive, there will be a discrepancy somewhere in one of these accounts. In this case, we've only got 2. There may be many more. But for rounding or whatever the reason, it doesn't balance, and this will be flagged to identify it as out of balance. Usually, if you import it into QuickBooks, you'll get a message saying that it's out of balance too, and it may not even post. You might need to reconcile that document in order for it to post correctly. But this is really a warning to the user to find out what's going on with that. We'll go back to rounding or something like that.
And would that occur, I would think most times, like if you were missing an account?
It could occur if you're missing an account, but the way that the QuickBooks, the way the link works is it will read in whatever is there. So if there's an account defined in Store Account Manager, right or wrong, it'll still read it in as that. And there are no accounts that would be listed in the Store Account Manager that don't have some sort of entry there from like the default. So it wouldn't be a null. But I guess for the sake of argument, yeah, that would be the case if there was no account that should be there that offsets some other account, like if you had purchase clearing and it didn't exist and you were reading in a purchase clearing document and you couldn't offset the inventory amount with it, then yeah, it would come in out of balance.
Okay.
So that's all the, those are the, I guess, the tough document types, the ones that most people use most frequently. Most people are using it for accounts receivable and accounts payable. The accounts payable really is what most people seem to use it for, but the accounting link will also read in slips, and it will also read in vouchers, of course. Slips don't really have much of an effect on if you're using a single company, but it really just moves it from one place to another, but doesn't have any real impact on inventory. So it doesn't have any, I guess, accounting impact from a cost or value of inventory standpoint. Memos, on the other hand, might. If you're doing cost memos or quantity memos, they're read in as well. And those are just typically, again, they'll be just general ledger entries in the system. So we're going to make this 100. I'll give this a little bit of a change. Update that, and then we'll read and post those guys. There's a slip, and it makes one for each location, and they literally offset each other. See?
Yeah.
And so it's really unless you're tracking separate accounts per store in the Store Account Manager, it doesn't have any real impact to, and even then it doesn't really have any real impact from the company standpoint for the value of inventory. But it can move it from one account to the other if you're tracking separate accounts for each store.
So in QuickBooks, you can only track your inventory as a whole. You can't, like I believe you said, you can't do any of the breakdown as far as departments.
Yeah, you can't break it down by department and that sort of thing from the sub-accounting standpoint, but what you can do, and that I've seen a lot of people do, or a number of QuickBooks specialists that I've worked with do, they'll set up separate accounts for separate stores. So they might have a checking account for store 1, checking account for store 0. And if you do that, if you set a separate account here, when you do that and you come up to the entire company, you'll see it says varies. And that typically means that there's a different account set for one or more of the accounts, or one or more of the stores underneath. But you can do that. You can read it in for separate stores, and each time a document is read for store 1, for instance, it'll apply the breakdown of the transaction to those accounts. And when it's posted and read in, provided there is an existing account, corresponding account in the accounting package, it'll go to that appropriate account as well. And that's kind of what I was leaning towards, or kind of indicating with the transfers, is that's really one of the situations where you might find some value in having more than one store to find if you're tracking slips, because then the inventory moved from one account to another.
Okay, but it's only at the store level. You can't break it down any further than that. There's no way to break it down by category or anything like that?
No, not no sub-accounting the way we do it with the other packages.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So we read that in. I think we posted both of those. I'll just read them in real quick so we can see one of every type of account. Yep, I posted that and post that. Oh wait, that didn't do anything. I guess I didn't change it enough. Oh, I read it in. That seems odd. I might have found a bug. Yeah, it should have read a cost difference in there. And it didn't unmark it either. Interesting. No, I might have to take that memo back and take a look at it offline. But it should have read in a cost difference. And that's our slip, and we're not going to see any change to inventory or anything really. But it does read in, and it makes a posting to the inventory account. Let's see, where is the inventory account? Somewhere in here we'll see slips, yeah, and offsetting. There's the offset. Yeah. So no real change. Okay. Any questions at this point? I think we've hit all the document types that are touched by QuickBooks and the link. Gone through the configuration. I'm going to have to figure out what's going on with those memos, because that should have actually read in a cost change when you make the quantity memo. So I don't know if there may be a bug in the latest build, but I'll test that. Aside from that, does anyone have any questions?
I don't. It was really helpful.
Oh, good.
I'm going to go back, and I've got mine halfway set up, but you really helped me with a lot of the stuff. And it would be okay if I had any additional questions going forward if I just emailed you?
Sure, yeah. Or if you want, I can.
All right.
Yeah, that'd probably be easier. Yeah, just shoot me an email.
All right, that'd be great. Thanks,
Yeah, because
Brendan.
then we can set something up to log in and set yours up if you're still having issues with it.
Okay.
All right.
Hey, Brendan.
Diane?
That is, I'll review it and stuff, but it was very, like I said, very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. For the sake of completeness, I don't know how much time it would take. Could you point out a few of the differences when setting up BusinessWorks? You said it's much simpler.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Given the overview that you just gave for QuickBooks, I'm just curious what would you do with BusinessWorks? Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see if I can think BusinessWorks is number 2. There we go. I'm not sure if I still have it set up in this install, but...
That's okay. If you can just speak to it, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I'll go through some of the settings, and that'll maybe give a little bit more illumination into, in some respects, it's easier to set up BusinessWorks. And definitely it has a little bit more functionality. So it sets up this part is the same, but the difference between, one of the key differences between BusinessWorks and say QuickBooks is that you could decide to sub-account on department and choose the detail at which you want to bring over that sub-accounting. So if you set this information up, when you read in a transaction, it would break these up based on the account that you specify here. So if I had a lot of accounts, a lot of departments, I could make one segment of the account sub-account directly to that particular vendor or department or price level or UDF. So that's one of the key features that works in BusinessWorks that we have trouble with in QuickBooks. The rest of these settings pretty much the same. AR options are essentially the same. The posting settings for the addressing and all that information is the same. Ditto down here. Store account manager. Probably the only real true advantage is that the original default chart of accounts that we run with this is actually based on BusinessWorks. So it's a little easier. In BusinessWorks, there's an account called one of the default pre-made accounts is called RPro. So you can actually just configure BusinessWorks right out of the box with a set of accounts that match these down to like 2 or 3 accounts. So that's a little easier. And then one of the other things that's gets nice about BusinessWorks is that you don't have to worry about setting any of the specific options for posting, to a particular account and then flushing it out in the store account manager with a different account. This is pretty much straightforward. The AP and AR options. There are some additional things that you can do with BusinessWorks, printing a statement, that sort of thing, and then the ability to decide on what part you want to be transmitted as part of the comment on the transaction itself. So you can do a little bit more things with the preferences and how the transaction is represented in BusinessWorks itself, so you can track it back to Retail Pro. Those are the main things. That, and of course, you can post to specific journals in BusinessWorks, so you can track separate journals for even if you wanted to return in regular receipts, or you can go to a common one. So that's kind of nice. And then one of the other things that is really handy, of course, is it handles terms for customers a little better, obviously, than BusinessWorks. The terms will at least go over for on the document itself, so that you can apply it a little easier for AR. That's pretty much the big differences, I'd say, between QuickBooks and BusinessWorks. That, and like I say, this is a direct link right into BusinessWorks. There's actually accounts in a BusinessWorks database that we're looking at here. This isn't just some file that we created as an export. So when we update customers or initialize vendors, it's actually going into the software, and I hope it's still working, but it's actually going into the software and successfully posting those into that database. So that's really a big difference between BusinessWorks and QuickBooks.
What's the latest version?
BusinessWorks and do the import, right?
Exactly. What I did just then was not only the posting aspect of it, but it was also the importing piece that we normally did, that we had to do manually in QuickBooks.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What's the latest version that it works with or is certified for, Brendan? And do we use the same kind of rule of thumb with QuickBooks in that the technology is pretty consistent from version to version, or do we have to be more cautious there?
With BusinessWorks and both Sage products, Mass ERP 100 and BusinessWorks, be much more careful because this is only 2011. I know it's been certified with 2013, but you have to be careful because things change in their product extensively sometimes, and we don't have as the method that we're using to integrate between the two systems is not as conventional as QuickBooks, obviously, because that's a standard file import that we're using in QuickBooks, so that's unlikely to change. In this case, we're using their API, which can change without as much information or without as much warning. So we really have to certify these ahead of time.
So it's certified
Yeah,
up to 2013 at this point.
Correct. 2013 for this, and Mass 90 is up to 4.5.
Great.
And this is the way the vendors look here. So it's much more, I guess, user-friendly in a lot of respects. It's certainly easier to set up from a technician standpoint. You know, there's other aspects of it, though. When you're doing that kind of, oh, just send it over here and see what happens, you'll get an error back, and that sometimes is a little more difficult to troubleshoot because you don't have access to that IIF file directly. You have to do a little more work to figure out technical issues sometimes, but it's certainly from the initial setup and from the typical use standpoint much easier to manipulate. All right. That answer your question there, Ted?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
Right.
Any questions, folks?
No, I think I'm good.
Great.
All right, and like I said, Diane, contact me an email if you need some assistance getting set up or have more questions. You got my email, right?
Okay, great. I do. Thank you so much, both of you.
And thank you, Brendan,
right.
for
Thanks,
taking the
guys.
time.
Hey, guys.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.